Welcome, everyone, to this episode of Beyond the Crucible. I'm Gary Schneeberger, the co-host of the show, and you have clicked play on, we hope you've clicked subscribe to, a show that deals with crucible experiences. Now, those things are, if you haven't heard what a crucible experience is before, a crucible experience is one of those moments in life that really feels like it knocks the wind out of your sails. It really feels like it can change the trajectory of your life. They are setbacks, failures, traumas, tragedies, things that happen to you, things that your actions sometimes cause. Here's the good news about why we talk about them. We don't do it here on Beyond the Crucible to build a virtual campfire and kind of sit around and swap war stories. We do it here to offer hope and encouragement to you in the midst of your own crucible, that they indeed can be moved, as the show's title suggests, beyond. And there is probably no one I know better um, who knows better what it is to move beyond a crucible than the host of our show, Warwick Fairfax. Warwick, welcome.
Hey, Gary. Very much looking forward to it.
We have today, listener, a what I think is going to be a fascinating story. Our guest today is Dean Niewolny, who spent 23 years in executive roles with three of Wall Street's largest financial firms, finishing his career in the financial sector as a market manager for Wells Fargo Advisors in Chicago, where he oversaw listen to this number, pretty impressive, a $100 million market. While in Chicago, he and his wife, Lisa, traveled many times to Africa and seeing the abject needs of widows and orphans, made life changes that enabled them to get involved, such as helping to complete an orphan home and a hospice home in Durban, South Africa. In 2010, Dean left his marketplace career to help more people who, like him, wanted to expand their own first half success and skills into passion and purpose for meeting human needs and making a significant difference. Dean joined the Halftime Institute as managing director and in 2011 became chief executive officer. 10 years later, in 2021, after all those years of faithful service, Dean stepped into the role of chairman of the board and halftime ambassador. He speaks at events around the world, encouraging business leaders to channel first half achievement into a second half defined by joy, impact, and balance. In 2017, Dean authored his first book, Trade Up: How to Go from Just Making Money to Making a Difference. We'll talk about that book and a whole lot more as Warwick begins our interview.
Well, Dean, thank you so much for being here. I love the title of your book, Trade Up: How to Move from Just Making Money to Making a Difference, and the whole notion of halftime to help leaders of organizations, business leaders, really all leaders, move from success to significance, which is sorely needed in our society. But just start us off, if you will, with the origin story, and understand that you grew up in Wisconsin, like my co-host here, Gary. So
that makes you the second guest from Wisconsin, Dean. Second guest from Wisconsin. We've had 127 from Australia, so we're catching up.
So well done.
Hey.
So, Dean,
we have two cheeseheads on here.
There you go.
Yes.
And I'm sure Packer fans, I'm guessing.
No doubt about that. No doubt about that.
Yeah. So anyway, so tell us just a bit about your family growing up in Wisconsin and kind of the background, which, obviously you end up at halftime. But what was it like for Dean growing up and your family, and, tell us a bit about the backstory.
Sure. Well, Gary, thank you for the introduction. Warwick, thanks for having me. What an honor to be on here with you guys. Yeah, I am a cheesehead. I'm a Wisconsinite, and grew up in a little town called Wausau, Wisconsin, in north central Wisconsin, and grew up with a fantastic family, probably a low to middle class family, I would say. We didn't have a lot, but we had everything that we needed. I have two sisters, and they're all back in Wisconsin and one living in Minnesota. So as a young guy, you know, we had what we needed. We were farmers and we worked hard. But I always had this dream at a young age of how can I get out there and be, you know, the next Warren Buffett, or the next Bill Gates. So as a young man, I ended up going to a school in Wisconsin, and then ended up getting hired initially by Arthur Andersen. I went out to be a consultant with Arthur Andersen, then went into the financial services industry, like Gary mentioned. So a very Midwestern upbringing and family of farmers. It was great.
So just in looking at your book, I think, you know, you tend to, I don't know, look over the fence or over the other side of the tracks, and just people who are successful and, hey, this could be me. There was just this drive for a young age. I know athletics was huge for you in high school and in college, but talk about, I mean, was that you? Was there any examples in your family? I mean, it seemed like almost from birth, you just had this drive to, you know, you wanted to make it in life. You know, you weren't just satisfied with status quo. So where did that come from? That just this drive?
Yeah, great question. I would say when I had fantastic parents. My dad's my best friend, very close to my parents. But we were always comparing ourselves to others. We would see others who had bigger cars or bigger homes and nicer things, if you will. And I just remember us always comparing ourselves to those folks. So as a young kid, it was ingrained into me that, you know what, I want to be one of those folks. I want to have those things, because that's what we were looking up to. So I thought, if I can just achieve what they've achieved, and that's success and money and material possessions, that'll bring me happiness. No disrespect to my mom and dad whatsoever, but as a young man, it was ingrained in me as I started to look at others that I want to be like those folks.
You know, it's kind of interesting because, yeah, obviously I grew up in Australia, but, you know, definitely respect America, and part of what makes America is the sense of inventiveness, the willing to try, the willing to fail, almost the sense of, you know, you want your kids to have a better life than you've had. You know, for 150, 200 years, it's always been the ethos. And it's not wrong to want to better yourself and do well and achieve, per se. So that notion you grew up with is probably a notion that many, if not most, American families grow up with. Say, you know, I want my kids, if I didn't go to college, I want my kids to go to college. I want them to have a better job than I did. That's generations of family in every state in the country has that ethos. So it's not unusual in that sense. And we'll get into, there's nothing wrong with success, but in of itself, you don't want to worship it. But I mean, as you look back, that probably wasn't that unusual in that sense. You know, your friends that you hung out with, I mean, it's probably, you weren't the only family that said, hey, we want to better ourselves and do well, right?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. You know, my son right now is 19 years old, and he talks like I did when I was a young kid. I want to be wealthy and I want to have all these things. But what ended up happening in my life is that became the center point of my life. That was the main focus. That you know, work was going to bring me happiness if I just focused on that. And so it was an idol to me. I was obsessed with it at a young age. So that becomes a challenge.
Indeed. So let's talk about that. An idol is a good word. So
Sure.
you started off in finance. I don't know if it was Arthur Andersen. You were thinking originally accounting, and you thought, I don't think I want to do this. I want to be in sales. I want to be, you know, I want to sell finance stuff. So talk a bit about those first few jobs as you, I think there was one you were sort of, as young brokers do, dialing for dollars, you know, like 300 calls a day, and you were disciplined, you were on it, and, you know, which is admirable. So talk about those early days as you were kind of working your way out.
Sure. I did become a stockbroker, but actually it wasn't a dream of mine. It happened when I was at Arthur Andersen, and the guy next to me said, you know, Niewolny, you don't know what you're doing. What are you doing here? You should go out and get a different job. So that's when I started to think, well, what should I do? I was 23 years old and decided, you know, being a stockbroker sounds like something that'd be really interesting. I knew nothing about stocks, nothing about the financial markets, and walked into the Merrill Lynch office way back in 1987 and just said, hey, I would really like to become a financial advisor. Do you have a position for me? And I'll never forget it. The gentleman that I was talking to was on his way to the Final Four basketball tournament. And he said, you know what? I don't have a lot of time right now. You seem like a good kid. Come back in 2 weeks and you have a job. So that was it. That started my financial career with Merrill Lynch in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, back in 1987. But you're right. What happened at the very beginning as a young financial advisor, my boss told me, you know, Dean, you need to make 250 dials every single day, 50 contacts every single day, and then hand the sheet in to me at the end of the evening, which I did. And he said, if you live 2 years like no one else wants to, you'll live the rest of your life like no one else can. And of course, this drug being money for me at the time, that was just music to my ears. So I was just locked and loaded for the next 2 years. I just dialed for dollars and made the cold calls and became reasonably successful at a young age at 23, 24 years old. So yeah, that's how I started in the financial business.
Wasn't there some key break you had? I forget if you're on the West Coast at that point. Some person had was moving, I think, to the West Coast or something, and you sort of, give me a shot. I mean, just some, it takes a lot of guts and get up and go. But that's a fascinating story because that was a key moment, it seems like.
Yeah, it was really in 1987, after October of 87, which was a rough month for the market. Actually, my dad was my first investor, so that was a little bit challenging. But anyway, I was dating a girl who actually moved out to California. And I followed her out to California and went to work in Carmel, California, which was very difficult as a 23-year-old. Growing up in northern Wisconsin, moving to Carmel, California was challenging. So what ended up happening, there was a very wealthy, successful businessman that moved to Pebble Beach. And he came in and said to the manager, I need a financial advisor. And I was what was called at that time the broker of the day. So he would get me. And I was this 23-year-old kid with long hair. And he looked at me and said, I don't want that kid. I mean, the kid's probably been in business for 6 months. Why would I want him? He had a very sizable portfolio and ran a company that we would all know if I mentioned it. So I had him in the office, sat down with him, and I said to him, Mr. So-and-so, listen, there are other financial advisors in this office, but they're older. They're probably tired. They're not as hungry as I am. I have to make sure I do well for you. Because if I don't, I'm not going to have a job. So anyway, one thing led to another work, and he became a client of mine, and that was a successful story. I wish they were all like that, but that was actually one of my first clients.
So over the years, you started kind of moving up the ladder, and I'm sure being a manager and being very successful. You had, I think, maybe several houses at one point, the lake house, the boat. So talk about, that rise, your dreams did come true in that sense. You were successful, you worked very hard, and I'm sure you earned your success. But talk about that sort of rise up the ladder from young stockbroker to, I guess the pinnacle being a manager of a $100 million portfolio at Wells Fargo. So talk a bit about that journey. Any sort of high points on the way?
Absolutely. Yeah. I did become, I was financial advisor out in Carmel, California, then moved back to the Midwest. And I was encouraged at that time to make a transition from Merrill Lynch to a company at the time called Payne Weber, which no longer exists, but they merged with Kidder Peabody and ultimately were bought by UBS. And I was encouraged at that time to move to Chicago and go into management. And what ended up happening is during that time, one of my crucible moments happened in 1994, right after I moved over to this new organization. I ended up going through a very difficult divorce at a young age. And I had to start over. Here I am in 1994. I'm 31. I'm successful. I'm making money, have all these different toys, married, and pretty soon everything unraveled, and I had to start over. But as I started over, I moved to Chicago, got into management, started moving up the ladder, and did various jobs. With UBS, I went down to Texas and then back to Chicago, and then became a regional manager and a market manager. But at the same time, as I started to rebuild it, I met this beautiful lady who's my wife, Lisa, and had two fantastic kids. And like you said, started accumulating possessions. We had a home in Chicago and a home outside of Chicago and a lake house. And actually, I became a pilot at that time and had a little airplane, nothing major, single engine, but a little airplane and a boat. And I was thinking to myself, as I continue to make money and accumulate these things, I'm just gonna have more joy in my life and more happiness. And what ended up happening, it was the complete opposite for me. It was the opposite. I actually had a bout with hives, and I was so stressed out thinking, well, I have to pay the insurance on that house. I have to get the airplane fixed. I got to take care of the boat, that I was so stressed out about taking care of my stuff that in 2006, I just had this moment where I just said, there just has to be more to life than this.
So talk about that scene. I think you wrote in the book, was it like the 40th floor of some massive skyscraper in Chicago and you're looking out? So just talk about that moment, because it feels like that's one of the pivotal moments in your life. It's just like, what is life about? So take us through that moment a bit as you're staring out that window.
Sure. I'm going to back up just a little bit. In 1999 or in 1995, I accepted Christ and started going to a church in Chicago. And my first thought was, well, if I accept Christ, I have to leave the marketplace and go into the ministry. I'm not supposed to stay in the marketplace.
Right.
And the pastor that weekend said, well, if everyone left the marketplace and went into the ministry, who would be a light in a dark world? So I was like, I'll stay in the marketplace. But in 1999, there was this gentleman that got interviewed, Bob Buford, and I was in the third row, and I was thinking, boy, that guy's impressive. He's talking about going from success to significance. And I'm thinking to myself, well, I'm all about this success thing. I'm not so sure about this significance piece. But then we fast forward 6 years from there to 2006, 40th floor of the Mercantile Exchange building, the corner office, all the homes and the airplane and the boats, beautiful wife, kids. And I just looked out the window one day. I shut the door, looked out the window one day and just said, God, there has to be more to life than this. There has to be more to life than this. And it was up to that point that I spent so much time focusing on myself. It was all about me and accumulating things and making me happy. And I wasn't thinking of others. And I just remember that day really, really well. I didn't hear an audible voice, but I felt the Lord say, Dean, I have other plans for your life. Start to simplify your life. And that was the episode on the 40th floor. It was a game changer. And my boss actually reached out to me 2 weeks later and said, would you be interested in doing a book study? And I said, absolutely. What's the book? And he said, it's Halftime. I'd like to read the book. Halftime. I said, well, I heard that guy get interviewed in 1999, and that was just perfect timing.
So what's fascinating about your story is it's not a simple kind of Paul road to Damascus moment. It seemed like it was a journey. You'd come to faith in Christ at a church in Chicago a few years before. You'd heard Bob Buford, who, for listeners, I think was from Texas and had a bunch of TV stations and was very successful, and obviously you know better than I do, but lost a son in I think a drowning accident which turned his life. And gosh, what is life about? You lose your only son. That's about as devastating as it could possibly can be. But it wasn't like this road to Damascus moment. Okay, I've accepted Jesus. Boom. Dean Niewolny's life instantly turns on a dime. It sounds like it, which is, I think it's more realistic, because for most people life doesn't change overnight. It's almost like being an aircraft carrier, right? It changes slowly. So just talk a bit about that journey, because I think it's very realistic and it's more typical. Do you know what I mean? Like it wasn't like, okay, it's all about significance, not about success. Money's irrelevant. It wasn't an overnight, moment.
Yeah. I'd even go back to 1995 when I accepted Christ. A lady in the office said, Dean, you're really going down a path that you shouldn't be. And she said, would you like to meet a friend of mine? And long story short, I met a friend of hers at Chili's for lunch, which was supposed to be an hour lunch, and it was 6 hours because he's a friend of mine now, my best friend. He was a pastor at the time,
Yeah.
and he kind of shared with me Jesus and forgiveness and that I didn't understand. But that was a journey for me. And the reason I mention it is at that time, I used to go to church, but I would go to church, after going out all night. But he was just happy to see me show up. So that was a journey in and of itself.
Right.
But you're right. I heard that, when I heard Bob speak in 1999 and he talked about this idea of going from success to significance, that really did begin a journey for me that I didn't even realize at the time. That just little by little, I started to look outward and I started to volunteer. And I worked, I served at a homeless shelter and I helped the homeless put resumes together so they could go out and get gainfully employed. But God was using that time in my life as building blocks to get me to this point of 2006. And, everyone doesn't need to make a transition like Bob Buford did from the marketplace to the ministry, or like I did. Most people actually stay in the marketplace. But for me, it was a journey. And if I look back, it's interesting. You can connect the dots and how it was a building block kind of effect up to 2006 when I had the 40th floor office experience.
I almost wonder. Please go ahead.
We're going to get into what significance is and how you discovered that. But for the listener who hears, this in apposition, the idea of success and significance and thinks, success still sounds like it might be kind of interesting. It's very rare to be sitting in a virtual space with two individuals who have had after their names $100 million, in your case, Dean, billions in your case, Warwick, and both of you have come to the same conclusion that success didn't bring happiness. For people who hear that sometimes and think it's empty, right? This idea of success doesn't really fulfill, that's not true. Success would fulfill me. It was just you had a problem with it. Talk a little bit, Dean, about what was it about success that was unfulfilling for you ultimately? There you were saying that the other side of the tracks is where happiness lies. It wasn't that. What was was there a moment besides your health failing? When did you start to sort of sniff that success just wasn't what you had made it out to be when you were younger?
Yeah, great question, Gary. Just to clarify too, I wasn't personally worth $100 million. I managed a $100 million business, but what ended up happening is as I started to be successful and started getting promoted and making more money and accumulating more things, it actually had the opposite effect for me. Like I said earlier, it started to cause me to be more stressed than I was without those things. So I really had to take time and think through, why is that? And what I want to make sure and say here is that going from success to significance doesn't mean you have to give up success. You surely can be successful and significant at the same time. I would argue that in today's day and age, with a younger audience, it's, hey, I want to be significant now. I want to make a difference now. So the idea of going from success to significance was a fantastic tagline in the 90s for the book Halftime, but that's a little dated in my opinion at this point. But for me personally, I just started to feel as I got more successful that every time I got more successful, there was another hill to climb. There was always someone else in front of me. There was always, it didn't matter what I accomplished. There was always someone else that I needed to try to jump over. And I'm like, well, this is just an endless game for me because it wasn't bringing me happiness. It was bringing me a lot of stress. And at the end of the day,
you were constantly crossing over the tracks, right? you were constantly trying to get to whatever was on the other side of the tracks over and over and over again. That's got to be exhausting.
Yeah, it was for me personally. For many others, it may not be. And having material possessions and money and all that, there's nothing wrong with that. It's for me, what was wrong with it is I made those things an idol. That was my total focus, right? So this idea of making money, nothing wrong with that. We need people to make money. Hey, our nonprofit needs money, so make money, But the reality is, how do you use that money? What is the money for personal gain, or what is it really for?
I mean,
so for me, that go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, no, it's such a good point what you're saying, and I mean, I have, as listeners would know, a very different journey, similar experience, but about as different a journey as you can imagine. Right. And listeners know this, but I grew up in about as wealthy family as you can imagine in Sydney, Australia. 150-year-old, very large media company, newspapers, TV, magazines. Not only did we have wealth, but we had status and respect. So for people in the marketplace, that's, you've won the lottery at that point. It's not, we didn't just have money, we had respect in society. Money, respect, status, what more is there that you want in life? Some people have money, but are not respected at all, But when you have all of them, you've got everything the world says that you would want. And so we had that. But yeah, we had parties with, people from Hollywood, ambassadors, business leaders, and it just all seemed to me so empty growing up. Everybody trying to impress each other with the deals they'd done and, royalty they'd met or whatever. And it just seemed so empty that it never was attractive to me. So I was almost inoculated at a young age. Yeah, I'd experienced all that, and it certainly wasn't making my family happy. If itself was, wealthy families have typically lots of problems, unfortunately. So, yeah, that was my, that wasn't really my story in that sense. It's money is, I have my temptations, but money has never been one of them because of the way I grew up. It's just, yeah. But on the other hand, like you, I'm not against success. I'm now maybe not blessed in terms of billions, but we're very blessed. We have a beautiful house in Annapolis and a lake house, and that's all good. But so I'm not against it. We can travel, do what we want. But so I want to transition here a bit to talk about halftime.
Can I just add something to that, Warren?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Just really quick.
Yeah.
Just going back to Gary's question, which was an excellent question. What I realized is as time went on and I became more successful and had opportunities to get promoted, take on other jobs, I got to this season in life that I now call my smoldering discontent season, where I was actually hoping I didn't get the promotion. I didn't and I remember Lisa and I had this dream of moving to Southern California, and I got recruited by this firm, and it was in Newport Beach, and it was everything you could dream of. And I remember praying at night, Lord, please just take this away, because I really didn't want it. So that's, you kind of get to this mountaintop, and then there's another mountain in front of you. So for me, that just didn't do it for me.
Yeah, I mean, there's always another mountain. So you mentioned that. We talk about this quite a bit, like in sports, you could be Roger Federer with, 20 majors, and undoubtedly Nadal or Djokovic will beat you. So being the greatest of all time, and whether it's football or tennis, that's a pretty tough thing. There's probably always going to be somebody to beat you. In the world of finance, maybe you're the top salesperson, but there's somebody's going to beat that record at some point. And, no matter how successful you are, and even if you are the greatest, in your case, finance person of all time, you're the most successful stockbroker in the history of the world, it still doesn't satisfy. I mean, it's a lose-lose game. But, the greatest of all time, it's hard to make it. And even if you do, it won't be fulfilling. But, so it's a tough thing.
And if Warwick...
Go ahead.
If I can jump in right
Please.
Before you turn into
Yeah.
And say something to our listeners that I think is fascinating by both of the stories that you've just told, because it's very rare it happens on Beyond the Crucible that this is true. In some ways, is it true for both of you that success was its own crucible? the way that you experienced success, the way that you chased it, the way that you sort of wrapped yourself around it, did that become at some point for both of you your own crucible?
Well, I'll chime in here. I would say for me, it's still a crucible that I'm working on. Absolutely, it was a crucible for me because it was my driving focus day in and day out. And but back prior to going through the halftime program and what I'm doing now in the nonprofit world, the idea was all about myself and focused on myself. Once I went through the program, I started thinking of others and trying to make a difference with my finances. But I'll tell you, every day, even now when I get up, I still have to pray every morning that that doesn't become an idol for me and that I don't focus on it day in and day out. And I'd love to say I'm succeeding at that, but I'm not. I have to work at that every single day.
Yeah, I mean, I want to come back to that in a second because that's such a, and thank you for being so honest about it because that is helpful. But yeah, for me, I guess the pinnacle of success, if you will, is, I launched this $2.25 billion takeover in late August 87, and within a few months it quote unquote succeeded, and I was controlling shareholder proprietor of this big company at age 26. The world would say, boy, controlling a multi-billion-dollar company at 26, that's pretty good. Not too many people have achieved that kind of benchmark. And a media company that had the equivalent of the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post. But yet, it was kind of miserable because, it was all, as listeners know, all about duty and living up to my great-great-grandfather's vision. And I wasn't even fulfilling my own vision. So it was, as soon as we had succeeded, it was miserable. I just did not want to be there. There was no joy, even though for me it wasn't so much about money. It was this idealistic vision. But yeah, I think what you just said about being aware of your idols and temptations, a wise man or woman does that. For me, it's not money, but it's more, my Wikipedia entry until recently was young, hot-headed kid could have had it all and blew it. Do I mind that? Yes, I do mind that. So, would it be nice if folks in Australia and the media gave me a little ounce of respect one day? It may never happen, but do I mind that? Sure. So, with this book that, by coincidence, at least on the day that we're recording, October 19 is the day that it actually comes out, which is sort of amazing benchmark. But when I first got a copy of that book a number of months ago, like in April, I was literally on my knees in prayer and saying, Lord, I don't care whether this book sells 1 or 10,000. My self-worth is not going to be bound up in book sales. My sense of, okay, here's back, finally I'll get some respect here. I don't want that desire for respect and that desire for redemption in the world's eyes to define who I am. And yes, I'm human, so if a gossip column comes out in one of the Australian papers, as it did a few weeks ago, and it was the snarky stuff like, hey, Warwick has a book which he'll sell you for a price. It's like, who sells a book for nothing? I mean, and it's like Warwick talks about failure. Well, he'd be an expert on that, wouldn't he? It's like, really? Did I mind that? Yes, I minded that. No, I mean, I've gotten over it, kind of, but do I mind that? Yes. So money is not my deal. It's more respect, redemption. And so, know your, for me, I wouldn't say idol, but know your temptations. And when you feel that little negative thought coming, if you're a person of faith, get on your knees, pray, and say, Lord, help me with this temptation. Don't let me have my self-esteem wrapped up in money, redemption, respect. It's from my and your perspective, it's only in you, Lord, not. So yeah, my temptations are different, but they're still temptations, if that makes sense.
Sure.
So, okay, let's talk about Halftime and your book, Trade Up, because I think this is fascinating. And there is one story in the transition that, I don't know, your wife, your wife's name is Lisa?
Lisa.
I don't know whether she's a prophet, but I guess she kind of was at one point, which is just crazy. So talk about that prophetic moment that she had about your role in Halftime, which at the time seemed like crazy stuff, right?
Yeah, it did. So I think she's a prophet. But anyway, what ended up happening is in 2008, I went through the halftime program after having this 40th floor office experience. And one thing I realized at that point is I'm going to figure out what God wants to do through me one way or another. And we read the book Halftime, went down to the halftime program, which was fabulous. And but at that point, I was still working in the marketplace. At that, we transitioned from Wachovia to Wells Fargo Advisors, and I was working there in Chicago, overseeing that business. And Lisa loved Southern California, still loves Southern California and Chicago. She knew of those two places on the map, right? And I said, well, why don't we go to Laguna Beach? They're having a halftime event. You can enjoy California, and I can enjoy halftime. And so we went together, and I had an interaction with a gentleman from Bob Buford's organization there that day. And he came up and said, hey, Dean, I really would like to get to know you better. Do you mind if I come up to Chicago and spend a little bit of time with you? And I said, sure. Right. You know, at that time, Halftime was looking to get into the financial services a little bit and partner with some financial services organizations. So I thought, sure, come on up to Chicago. Well, that night we go to bed, and 3 o'clock in the morning, and this is not like my wife whatsoever, by the way, woke up at 3 o'clock in the morning. She's sitting straight up. And I said, what happened? She goes, I just had a dream. I said, a dream about what? She said, the dream was about we're moving from Chicago to Dallas, Texas, and you're going to become the CEO of the Halftime Institute. And I said, Lisa, that's the craziest thing I've ever heard. I said, they probably want me to come to talk about the financial services industry and that connection. She said, no, you're going to become the CEO and we're moving to Dallas, Texas. Well, I knew when she said Dallas, Texas, that had to be from the Lord, because it wasn't from her. That's not where we were thinking of moving. But nonetheless, he came, and 4 months later, they offered me the position, as you mentioned earlier, of managing director of Halftime. So I said, Lisa, see, I wasn't the CEO. I was the managing director. And then a year later, they changed it and said, now you're the CEO. So yeah, it was a dream that she had. That's why we're here.
So talk a bit about Halftime, and because not everybody will be familiar with Halftime, and then obviously that leads into your book. So what is the mission of Halftime? What's its vision?
Sure. The vision really is to help men and women around the world identify what we call their Ephesians 2:10 calling. So Ephesians said, we are God's workmanship, created in Christ Jesus to do good works that he has prepared beforehand. So we believe that everyone has good works that the Lord has given to them. And Halftime helps men and women all over the world identify what are their strengths, what are their spiritual gifts, what are their passions, and we connect them into those things. So we really teach, coach, and connect individuals around the world into their 2:10 calling, as we like to say.
You know, one of the things I found fascinating in your book, and I can relate to this, that a lot of churches and places, some business man or woman comes to faith, and it's like they don't know what to do. So maybe they start being an usher, or, you know, setting chairs, and there's nothing wrong with doing any of that. But the question is, from God's perspective, is that the best use of their gifts for the kingdom, setting chairs or being an usher? Again, it's not about it being beneath you, but it's kind of what's, you know, and it's funny, I guess, that there's a story in my life that really directly relates to, I think, to me, what's the core, from what I understand, Halftime concept is just leading to your gifting and, I would say, God-given passions and calling. There was a time, as listeners would know, I was, you know, back in the 90s when I was not doing too well, just after, you know, this whole company went under, and felt like I'd, you know, let God down. The founder of the company was a strong believer. It was a pretty, when you feel like you've let God down, that's a pretty crushing crucible for a believer. Anyway, I ended up working in aviation services company doing financial and business analysis, because I'm pretty analytical and I can do that. But I remember in 2003, I felt like the Lord telling me, you know, you're playing small. You're not honoring me with all the gifts and abilities that I've given you. And it wasn't so much that it was beneath me, but yet I had more to offer. Then I got into coaching a couple of nonprofit boards, including my church board, and then from there, Crucible Leadership, which is a whole nother story. But that was a pivot point for me, feeling like the Lord saying, "You're playing small. You're dishonoring me because you're not using all of the gifts you have for the kingdom." That feels like, I didn't know it at the time, but it's sort of a halftime way of thinking, wouldn't you say, in terms of halftime's philosophy?
Absolutely. Yeah. Warwick, I like to say, volunteering is something you get to do. Your calling is something you have to do.
Mm-hmm.
And very rarely do folks take the time to really understand what is their true calling. God gifts us and provides us with strengths and spiritual gifts and abilities. And I believe he wants to use those and plug them into areas of need. And like we say, things that Jesus really cares about, the orphans, the widows, the prisoners, others. So when I was younger, I volunteered, like I said, for a homeless shelter, which was fantastic. I loved it. I enjoyed helping them put their resumes together. But my skill set and my ability allowed me to do more than that and make a bigger impact. It's the leverage impact. So I agree with what you're saying.
So talk about how halftime does this, because we talk about this a bit in Crucible Leadership. But so let's say a leader comes in, they're probably still on the fast track initially, but they're curious about halftime and about Jesus and all. So how do you begin to turn that ship in terms of finding their calling? Talk a little about, at least at a high level, some of the elements that halftime does to try to, is that newbie CEO type comes in and is all about focus on success, but yet they're curious about the Lord, and you try to turn them, into, what's the Ephesians 2:10 work that God would have for them. So how do you do that? Because it sounds like not an easy thing to achieve or to accomplish.
Yeah, most folks who come through the program are actually at that point that I was at, that smoldering discontent state, trying to figure out, what is my life really all about? And most successful leaders, not all, but most successful leaders that I've encountered really struggle to have close relationships, close friends, and they're lonely, right? If you're a CEO or a leader and you're struggling through a crucible issue, who do you go talk to? You're not going to talk to your staff or your team. And so most come ready to really figure out, what does God want to do through me? What's the next season look like? And all people want to leave a legacy and have an impact and make a difference. So when they get there, we have different exercises that really allow that person to be vulnerable and open and safe. And we go about it in such a way that once they get authentic and real, we start talking about the head journey, which is, of course, the head journey has to do with we decide what we think we're going to do or what we're good at. But then there's the heart journey. There's the Holy Spirit. There's the guidance from God who guides you. So it's the head and heart journey. So at first, you're right. When they get there, I would say most are struggling through something. They're unhappy. They're at this point where I want more to my life. I want to make a difference. It may be initially they're struggling in their marriage or with their kids or don't have relationships there. So we help with those things to help them get free and then get clear and get going, as we'd like to say. So it's a very interesting process that if someone comes in and they have an arrogance about them and they're not ready to be coached and they're not in that season, it is difficult. You're absolutely right. But most are ready to do that.
And you have a couple of fascinating things. I think you talk about also in your book, the whole 80th birthday party experience. What do you want your legacy to be? That's such a powerful question. Talk just a little bit about the concept of legacy and that 80th birthday party image, because it's a fascinating image.
Yeah, it brings back scary memories for me, quite honestly. But I remember what ended up happening. I was working at the time still in the marketplace, and I actually did go to a funeral for a lady who was a teacher, and there was 500, 1,000 people there. And I was like, why are so many people here? And they said, well, it's because the impact that she had on their
Mm-hmm.
lives, the difference
Mm-hmm.
she made, right? And I thought, I was sitting in the pew thinking to myself, well, if today was my funeral, one, would anyone show up? But secondly, what would they say about me?
Mm-hmm.
And that was a very scary thought at the time. So when I got to halftime, they do an 80th birthday party exercise. I guess now we should up it to 85 or 90. But you're invited to your birthday party. Your wife or good friend takes you out, or spouse takes you out, and 200 of your closest friends are in the room, and there's a microphone up in the front of the room. And one by one, they walk up and talk about the difference you made on humanity, not on yourself.
Mm-hmm.
What difference have you made on humanity? What difference have you made on others? And what would you like to hear? And I remember when we went through that exercise, I was like, they would say, hey, Dean's successful, making a lot of money, he has all these different toys, but the impact I had on others or humanity was very minimal at the time. So it's an exercise as you think forward, at the end of your life, what do you want your legacy to be? What impact have you had? That's the 80th birthday party exercise.
I love that. And one of the things I sometimes talk about, obviously in the world of finance, you talk about ROI, but I often think, what about EROI, the eternal return on investment? And I wonder if the time is like, hey, what's my EROI? What kind of impact am I having for the kingdom? Would I invest in me, at that age? I mean, that would have been an interesting conversation at that time, Would I get the, well buy said. This stock or not buy this stock from a kingdom perspective,
Well said. I never thought about it that way, but you're right.
But and one of the other things I love about Halftime is you talk about having a personal board of directors that will ask good questions, but these are people that know you. I think you mentioned, your wife, your coach within Halftime. But talk about that whole concept, because most people do not have a personal board of directors that have the backstage pass, the freedom to say, hey, Dean, Warwick, there's a problem here, It's really, I mean, who sets themselves up for those conversations?
Sure,
nobody. Absolutely. So talk about why that's so powerful.
Yeah, the personal board of directors is critical. I think it's right up there with coaching that we do at Halftime. The personal board of directors, to have those cheerleaders when you need those cheerleaders, when you're down and you're struggling, you need cheerleaders around you. When we talk about the characteristics of someone who finishes well, there's 5 things. And one is have a group of encouragers around you. So the personal board of directors, for me personally, has been life-changing. I identified 4 personal board members, if you will, and any good company, of course, has a strong board. And so for my board, I actually have someone when I'm having marital issues or issues with my children, there's someone who's a pastor that I would reach out to for that. And if I'm having challenges maybe around business, there's someone that I chat regarding that. So I have 4 to 5 folks on my personal board of directors, but they have carte blanche. They can say anything to me, and I want them to say what's on their heart. It might not be what I want to hear, but it's probably what I need to hear, right? So I don't mind them sharing. And if it's the person that at 3:30 in the morning, if I have a major issue, is going to answer the phone and be there. And you're right, most don't have that, but it's really something that's vital to have, for sure.
Yeah, just keep you on the path you want to be on. You mentioned those 5 things. Are these the 5 characteristics of leaving a legacy? Those are the 5 you're talking about. So just give us a little overview of those 5, because you mentioned, I guess the second one is maybe cheerleaders, the personal board of directors, but talk about some of the other 5.
Sure. So health is critical. So the 5 characteristics of those who finish well really has come out of countless hours of coaching over the years, tens of thousands of hours. And the 5 that have come out of that, believe it or not, is number 1, those who succeed and win and leave a legacy. have taken care of their health, because it's hard to go and live out your Ephesians 2:10 calling if you're not healthy.
Indeed.
Right? And so you need to be healthy. They're flexible meaning as we get older, and I'm surely guilty of this. I'm getting old and stodgy. I don't want to make changes. I don't want to make adjustments. My son just had a football game that was changed 10 miles away, and I was complaining about them changing the site, so not very flexible. But those who are flexible absolutely succeed. Then you have, I already mentioned, the encouragers, those folks around you who are encouragers, and of course your spouse and others. You want to identify those folks. The fourth would be your family. Put your family number one. This was a big learning for me. When I went to halftime, I remember Bob Buford asking me, "Where's Lisa in all this?" And I said, "Well, I don't know where Lisa is, but I know I need to get going, and I got to figure out my 2:10 call, and I'm going." And he said, "Dean, whatever you do, just stop. And so putting others' interests ahead of your own, and then of course your calling, figuring out what is your Ephesians 2:10 calling, what's God's calling on your life. Those are the five.
And I think that's.
Speaking of,
please go ahead.
I was going to say, speaking of calling, one of my callings as co-host of Beyond the Crucible is to note when the sound I hear in the distance is the captain turning on the fasten seatbelt sign to indicate that we're getting close to when we're going to land the plane. We're not going to land it yet, but it's time to gather our peanut bags up and get ready to give them to the flight attendants to throw away. So Warwick, is in the time we have left, I know you have some questions you want to ask Dean. Go ahead and do that. Just wanted to fulfill my calling as the co-host.
All good. Yeah, this whole notion of calling, I think, is so important and so kind of misunderstood. When I do just informal coaching for friends, and maybe they've sold a business, or I don't know, maybe they're in transition, and I say, "Well, tell me about your skills and abilities and your passions," and they can answer that. And then I say, "So tell me, what do you think is something that would advance, God's kingdom? What's your kingdom purpose?" And mostly, not only can they not answer the question, they don't understand the question. These are believers. The kingdom purpose is as if I was speaking a foreign language, some unintelligible tongue. So, and I imagine you probably find that, but it's just so important that every believer, every person in the halftime orbit, I'm sure that you focus on, is just saying, "Well, Lord, why am I here?" In my case, it took me a while to figure that out, which would be a whole nother discussion, but to me, it's using my story of, brokenness and losing a $2 billion plus company in trying to help other people bounce back from their worst day to stop their worst day defining them. And I do it with believers, non-believers. I'm very clear about my Christian faith. So I have a very clear calling, a kingdom calling. I'd like to think that and that does bring joy. When I've, just one person, if I help one person, or one person said, "Thank you for helping me share my story," that means everything. So that's so important. So I guess as we kind of wrap up, there's so much in the book that we can't get to. And, I'd encourage all listeners to get Trade Up, How to Move from Just Making Money to Making a Difference. And I love the phrase that you and Halftime use. It's from not just from success to significance, but success to significance to surrender. Oh my gosh, that's a powerful concept. So I wanted to this maybe last question, in maybe, I think it's first chapter, you ask these three incredible questions like, is there not a cause? Is there in you a sweet spot? And what is your giant? Which is kind of the smoldering discontent. But just that notion, is there not a cause? I guess that's relating to calling, right? That's like the first question. You start out with the book, you use the example of David. So talk about, because I love that phrase, is there not a cause? So to just talk about that phrase.
Sure. Most folks, or a lot of folks, feel they don't have a passion around anything. And what we find out is everyone's passionate about something. Everyone's passionate about some cause. So we do an exercise where we ask folks, why don't you read the USA Today for a week and come back to us and let us know what makes you mad, sad, or glad? What really catches you, right? So this idea of having a cause or something that you really care about, that you're passionate about, everyone has it, but it takes time to uncover it. It's not a weekend seminar where all of a sudden it just kind of pops up. Now it can happen that way, but usually it takes time to uncover it. The second part is, I think folks sometimes make it too complicated. We have a lady that went through the halftime program, and she said, you know what I love to do? I love to rock babies. So she rocks babies of drug addicted mothers in Houston at a hospital. Another gentleman went through, and his passion was prayer. He wanted to see more prayer, and he invited a few folks to pray, and that has turned into the global day of prayer. So his passion was prayer. Her passion was rocking babies. Everyone has a passion. And I remember something that really stands out to me when we had a group in, and the gentleman said, I'm really not passionate about anything. And about 30 seconds later, he starts talking about, I just wish everyone could go to college. I don't know why some get to go to college and some don't. And right there was his passion, right? Education for everyone. So the cause, is there not a cause? Everyone has a cause. Everyone has a passion.
And within that cause is somebody's God-given calling. And, you know, as we say in Crucible Leadership, you want to align it with your divine design, because our belief is God doesn't make mistakes. So if he designed you a certain way, he wants you to use that for his purpose. So you link up your design, you know, your God-given passions with calling. In our world, often that can come out of a crucible. It doesn't have to, but, you know, I don't want anybody ever to go through what I went through, whether it's abuse or could be a cancer survivor. So all in there is calling. And maybe the final observation for me, at least, is as I've found that I've, you know, used my brokenness and gifting for, I'd like to think, a kingdom calling, there's some level of not just joy, but healing. It makes it easier to go through the pain. And I guess as we close here, I mean, have you found that? Because, look, I've certainly made massive mistakes, and it sounds like you've made some things that maybe you would look at as maybe suboptimal choices. In other words, maybe mistakes. But does it make it easier to deal with when it's like, okay, you know, I'm living my Ephesians 2:10 calling, and do you know what I mean? Because sometimes we can be our own worst critic, and it's like, okay, I was young, I made mistakes, but it's when you're using your gifting in service of others, maybe it's a little easier to forgive yourself a little bit. If that makes some degree of sense.
Yeah, and I'd even add to that sometimes the pain in your life ultimately turns into your calling. It has for you, and it has for others. Who better to guide and coach than someone who's been down a path that you're struggling with? So it may be divorce. Who knows what it may be? But yeah, sometimes pain turns into this opportunity to help others. And ultimately, you find joy in the pain that you had before because you're serving others, for sure.
Absolutely. And as you know, you come across some maybe 30, 40 something person in the world of finance is just killing it, and, you know, has got the fast car and the boat and the houses and is doing great. Who better to talk to that person than Dean Niewolny? It's like, I've been there. You know, I was you. You know, you don't want to be doing that in 20 years' time. You know, you'll have no relationship with your wife, kids. You know, trust me, you don't want to be there. So, you know, you'll be the perfect person to minister to that person, right? So, you know. Well, thank you. Thank you for what you do. And I love what you do in halftime, and just your book, Trade Up, How to Move from Just Making Money to Making a Difference. And really, I want listeners to hear, you know, we're not against success. You just don't want success, as you very well put it, to be an idol. Success is fine if you have it, you know, use it for the right purposes. You just don't want to worship it. You know, worship it, easier said than done. But yeah, and Halftime is a great organization. They will help you understand in a practical ways how to move from success to significance, and ultimately to surrender. I mean, it's all the Lord's, and we're just here as managers and his servants. So that's sort of the ultimate destination spiritually and in terms of joy and fulfillment. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you,
Flight
Mark. Gary, thank you.
and the flight manifest would say that this is the time for the captain to actually land the plane, but I've radioed the cockpit just to delay that a little bit because I want to make one thing clear to our listeners from you, Dean, and that is this. I think when people hear the name halftime, they're like me. They may not be very good at math, but they can divide things in two. And they go, okay, halftime, if you're supposed to kind of change your life from success to significance, halftime means if the average life expectancy is, let's say, 85, there I go, I give myself a number, 84, you go to 42, it's at 42 that you're supposed to do this. It's not exactly that specific. You've described it. It's not so much an age halftime as it's what? How would you define it for people to help them understand?
Sure, it's a season of life. It's the season that you're in. So halftime, the sweet spot used to be the 45 to, let's say, 60-year-old. But what we have seen is that now 20 somethings and 80 somethings are in that season of halftime. So it's not defined by age. It's defined by the season of life that you're in. You can have smoldering discontent when you're 27 years old. We just had a gentleman go through our program who was 27, and he was trying to figure out what's next. And we had someone who was 83. So great question, Gary. The halftime does sound like it's, 45 years old or whatever, but it's really much broader than that.
And that sound you just heard was the captain putting the plane on the ground. The last word's been spoken on this conversation. Listener, I have sort of a different ending than I normally do here, and that's this. Because we just kind of expressed this idea, maybe you were listening to this going, well, I'm 27, so I don't have to worry about this. What Dean just said was it's for anybody. It's a season of life. It's never too early. I think everybody on this conversation would agree. It's never too early to begin thinking about how you can live your life, pursue your purpose to help others to live your life of significance. So I would say that the learning, your homework assignment here, regardless of whether you're 24 or 94, your homework assignment here is to go back and listen to the section where Dean talks about those 5 characteristics of people who finish well. They know their calling. They're living their calling. They have cheerleaders, what Dean described as a personal board of directors who can speak truth to them. They're really focused on their family. They have taken care of their health. It's really hard to live your life with significance if you have to live your life marginally because your health has suffered. So, especially in your earlier years in life, right? Take care of your health. And then finally, the flexibility so that when they change your son's sporting events to 10 miles away, you're like, okay, great. I get to spend 10 more hours or 10 more minutes in the car to chat with my boy. That's the way to look at it. Listener, thank you so much for spending time with us on this episode of Beyond the Crucible. We hope you have learned some things here that will indeed help you as you look to move beyond your crucible. And we really encourage you to remember as you sort of think about what we've discussed on the show, what Warwick and Dean have discussed. Hopefully it's come through loud and clear that your crucible experiences are painful. We know that. We have 2 men here who have described their crucibles, different crucibles, some similarities, but different circumstances, but the emotions are the same and they're painful, painful things. But here's the good news. Your crucible's not the end of your story. In fact, if you learn the lessons of that crucible, if you apply the lessons from that crucible to your life moving forward, it can be the leaping off point to a whole different and a whole better life. Far from being the last chapter in your story, your crucible can be the beginning of a new story, a new chapter in your story, and the best one of all, because where it leads, by the time you get to the final period on the final page, where it leads is to a life of significance.